In the world of the city's most dangerous elite, silence isn't just golden. It is a death sentence for anyone who dares to break it. I learned this the hard way at the Onyx Lounge, the exact moment the heavy velvet curtains parted and the vain shadow turned the room to ice. My name is Sheila, a waitress who specialized in being invisible. But as Caspian Vane walked in with a security detail, I realized that tonight there was nowhere to hide. Caspian didn't just occupy space, he consumed it. He was a man carved from shadow and sharp angles, wearing a suit that likely cost more than my entire education, and eyes that held the chilling stillness of a predator mid-hunt. Behind him was Lyra, his 7-year-old daughter, a porcelain-perfect girl with vacant eyes that seemed to scream through the silence. The music stuttered, the live pianist's fingers slipping on a chord before fading into a low, mournful hum, and wealthy patrons suddenly found their steaks fascinating, terrified to make eye contact with a man who controlled the city's pulse with a flick of his wrist. Before we continue our story, make sure to hit like, share, and subscribe button, and really, I'm curious, where are you watching from? Drop your country name in the comments. I love seeing how far our stories travel. The air pressure in the Onyx Lounge dropped, so sharply my ears popped. My manager, Mr. Henderson, a man who usually barked orders like a drill sergeant, was suddenly reduced to a trembling mess, his face the color of bleached bone. He didn't even look at the reservation book. Everyone knew that Table 0, the secluded booth in the far corner shrouded by shadows and velvet, stayed empty for only one reason. Sheila, Henderson hissed, his voice cracking as he shoved a heavy leather menu into my chest. You're the only one who hasn't fainted yet. Go. Table 0. Don't look him in the eye. Don't speak unless spoken to. And for the love of God, don't spill a drop of water. I felt the weight of a dozen stairs as I walked across the floor. My heels, which usually clicked rhythmically, felt muffled by the suffocating tension. As I approached, the two shadows, Caspian's personal security, stepped aside just enough to let me pass, their eyes scanning me for weapons with a cold, mechanical precision. Caspian Vane sat with a terrifying stillness. He wasn't looking at me. He was looking at the small girl beside him. Lyra was a masterpiece of grief. She sat with her back ramrod straight, her small hands vibrating against the white linen tablecloth. She was overwhelmed. I could see it in the way her eyes darted to the flickering candles and the way she winced at the distant clink of a fork. I set the water carafe down, my hand surprisingly steady. Most people would have seen a bratty, silent child, but I saw the frantic movement of her fingers under the table. She wasn't just fidgeting, she was signing. It was the liturgy of the blind, a tactile language so rare that most modern schools didn't even teach it anymore. My aunt had taught it to me in the dark of her small apartment when her sight began to fail. Too loud. Too much light. Make it stop. Lyra's fingers tapped against the mahogany edge of the table. Without thinking about the danger, without considering the man who could have me erased from the city's records by morning, I reached out. I didn't grab her hand. I simply rested my fingertips on the table near hers and tapped back in the same rhythm. I hear you. Focus on the cool water. The room is large, but you are steady. The change was instantaneous. Lyra's fingers froze. Her head snapped toward me. Her vacant eyes suddenly flooded with a desperate, piercing intelligence. She grabbed my wrist. A move so sudden that the security guard shifted, their hands moving toward their jackets. Where Caspian's voice cut through the silence like a razor through silk. Did a waitress at a place like this learn the language of my daughter's soul? I looked up, finally meeting his stormy gray gaze. The vain shadow wasn't just fear, it was a profound, aching loneliness. I learned it from someone who lived in a world of silence, Mr. Vane. I replied, my voice echoing in the hushed restaurant. Sometimes the quietest people have the most to say. In that moment, the entire restaurant didn't just stop breathing. They realized the world had just shifted. I wasn't just a waitress anymore. I was a bridge. And Caspian Vane was a man who took whatever he wanted across. The silence that followed my touch was so absolute it felt like a physical weight, pressing the oxygen right out of my lungs. I didn't pull my hand away. To retreat now would be to admit I had done something wrong, but in the language of the hands, there are no accidents, only intentions. I kept my fingertips light against Lyra's small, pale knuckles, feeling the frantic hummingbird pulse of her blood. Caspian Vane leaned forward. The movement was slow, deliberate, and carried the terrifying grace of a landslide. The men in suits, his shadows, took a synchronized step closer. I heard the sharp intake of breath from the kitchen doorway, where I knew Henderson was likely praying for my soul, or at least for the restaurant's insurance policy. Where Caspian's voice was a low, melodic rasp that vibrated in the soles of my feet. Did a waitress at a place like this learn the liturgy of the blind? I didn't blink, though my heart was trying to kick its way out of my chest. My aunt, I said, my voice steadier than I felt. She lost her sight and her hearing within a year of each other. She told me that the world is too loud for people who can't filter the static. We learned to speak through the skin because the air was too crowded with lies. Caspian's eyes, which I thought were black, were actually a deep, stormy gray. They searched mine with a clinical, terrifying intensity. He looked at me not as a servant, but as a puzzle he intended to solve, piece by agonizing piece. For a long moment, he didn't speak. He looked down at my hand, my plain, unadorned hand resting against his daughter's, and then at Lyra. Lyra's reaction was the true catalyst. The girl, who had spent the last 20 minutes looking like a statue trapped in a nightmare, suddenly leaned toward me. She didn't just touch my hand, she grabbed my wrist with a strength that surprised me. Her fingers tapped out a sequence so fast I almost missed it. Father. She hears the hum. Make her stay. A ghost of a smile, sharp, brief, and utterly chilling, flickered on Caspian's lips. He looked back at me, and the predatory edge in his gaze shifted into something more complex. Something possessive. It seems, Sheila, he said, using my name for the first time, a name I hadn't given him, that you have a rare gift for translation. My daughter hasn't acknowledged another human being outside of her tutors in 3 years. And yet, she wants to know if you hear the hum of the lights. I do, I whispered, looking directly at Lyra. I tapped against her wrist. The lights are humming a song about the rain. It's okay to listen. Lyra's shoulders dropped. The tension that had held her rigid since she entered the Onyx lounge evaporated. She reached for a piece of bread, her first movement toward food all evening. Mr. Vane, I said, realizing the entire restaurant was still staring, would you like to hear the specials, or should I bring the chef's tasting menu? Lyra seems to prefer the quiet of the sea. The sea bass is excellent tonight. Caspian leaned back, crossing one leg over the other. The Vane shadow seemed to expand, reclaiming the room, but the center of it, the table where we sat, remained a strange, quiet island. Bring the sea bass. For both of us. And Sheila. I paused, the water carafe still in my hand. Yes, sir. Do not send anyone else to this table. Not for the wine, not for the bill, not to clear the crumbs. If I see a hand other than yours near my daughter tonight, I will consider it a personal insult. I nodded, my throat dry. I understand. As I turned to walk away, I felt his gaze burning into the small of my back. I could feel the eyes of the other patrons, too. The mixture of awe and pity. They thought I was a hero. They didn't realize I was already a captive. When I reached the kitchen, Henderson grabbed my arm, his face the color of spoiled milk. What did you do? He hissed. You touched the girl. You touched a Vane. Do you have any idea what happens to people who overstep with him? He wants a sea base, I said, pulling my arm away. My skin felt electric, the sensation of Lyra's grip still lingering on my wrist like a brand. And he doesn't want anyone else coming near the table. If you want to keep your lounge standing, I suggest you stay out of my way. I spent the next hour moving in a blur. Every time I returned to table 0, the atmosphere was different. Caspian wasn't talking to me, but he was watching. He watched how I placed the silverware, how I tilted the bottle of wine, how I never once flinched when his security guards shifted their weight. But mostly, he watched the way Lyra's eyes followed me. She was no longer vacant. She was tethered to me by a thread of silent language. Every time I passed, I would tap a small rhythm on the edge of the table, 1, 2, 1, 2, a heartbeat to keep her grounded. When the meal was over, Caspian didn't reach for a wallet. He simply stood up. One of his men stepped forward and placed a heavy, cream-colored envelope on the table. "You are wasted here, Sheila," Caspian said, his voice dropping to a private whisper that didn't reach the ears of his guards. He stepped closer, invading my personal space until I could smell the faint, expensive scent of sandalwood and cold steel. The Onyx Lounge is a place for people who want to be seen. You're someone who sees. That is a dangerous quality in this city. He reached out, and for a terrifying second, I thought he was going to touch my face. Instead, his hand hovered just an inch from my cheek, the heat of his palm radiating against my skin. "We will be seeing you again. Very soon." He turned and walked out, Lyra trailing behind him. She paused at the velvet curtains, looking back at me one last time. She raised her hand and made a single, sharp sign, "Wait." The restaurant exploded into hushed, frantic whispers the moment the doors swung shut. I stood there, rooted to the spot, looking at the cream-colored envelope. When I finally opened it, I didn't find cash. I found a check that would cover my rent for a year and a small, handwritten note on heavy cardstock. "The silence is over, Sheila. Don't try to hide in it again." My hand shook as I tucked the note into my apron. I looked at the table, the empty glasses, the crumbs of the sea base, the spot where Lyra had grabbed my wrist. I had wanted to be invisible. I had spent my whole life perfecting the art of being a shadow among shadows. But as I looked at the check and the warning, I realized the vain shadow hadn't just passed over me. It had claimed me. That night, as I walked home through the rain, I didn't feel the usual exhaustion. I felt a cold, sharp prickle of anticipation. The city felt different. The streetlights didn't just flicker, they hummed. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel alone in the dark. I felt hunted. And the most terrifying part? A small, buried part of me didn't want to hide anymore. The following morning, the sun didn't so much rise as it did struggle through a bruised, charcoal sky. I woke up with my heart already racing, the phantom sensation of Lyra's grip still tightening around my wrist. In the cold light of my cramped studio apartment, the events at the Onyx Lounge felt like a fever dream, until I reached for my apron and felt the weight of the cream-colored envelope. I pulled out the check. The numbers were crisp, staggering, and undeniably real. It was enough to make me quit my job, move across the state, and start over. But I knew better. In this city, you didn't take Caspian Vane's money and run. You took it as an anchor, a weight meant to keep you exactly where he wanted you. I arrived at work 3 hours early, hoping to hide in the prep kitchen, but the atmosphere at the lounge had shifted. The staff, usually a cynical, loud bunch, went silent as I walked through the service entrance. They didn't look at me with the usual camaraderie of shared labor. They looked at me with a mixture of awe and the kind of pity one reserves for a terminal patient. "Sheila," a voice hissed. It was Marco, the head bartender, a man who usually spent his time perfecting his scowl. He beckoned me into the darkened bar area. "What the hell happened last night? The talk in the back is that you put your hands on the Vane girl. People are saying you're a dead woman walking, or worse, his new favorite toy." "I was just doing my job, Marco," I said, trying to keep my voice flat. She was distressed. "I helped." Marco grabbed a glass and began polishing it with aggressive, nervous energy. "You don't just help people like them. You survive them. Listen to me. I've seen girls get noticed by men like Vane before. It starts with a big tip, then it's a car, then it's a lifestyle you can't afford to lose. And then they own the air in your lungs. If you have any sense, you'll take that money and disappear before the sun sets." I opened my mouth to respond, but a sudden commotion at the front entrance cut me off. The heavy velvet curtains didn't part this time. They were practically torn aside. A courier in a sleek, unmarked uniform marched toward the host stand, carrying a massive arrangement of white lilies, the kind used for both weddings and funerals. He didn't ask for the manager. He looked straight at me. "Sheila Thorne?" he asked, though he clearly already knew. "A delivery for you." The card was tucked deep within the lilies. It wasn't a note. It was a bill of sale. My heart plummeted. It was a receipt for a vintage, restored sedan, the exact make and model my father had driven before the accident that took him. Beneath the receipt were 4 words written in that same heavy, elegant hand. Safety is a choice. He's insane, I whispered, the scent of the lilies suddenly cloying and funereal. The rest of the shift was a blur of paranoia. Every time the door opened, I flinched. Every time a black SUV slowed down on the street outside, I stopped breathing. I felt like a marked woman. By the time my shift ended at midnight, I was exhausted, my nerves frayed to the point of snapping. I walked out the back exit, clutching my bag to my chest, my eyes scanning the shadows of the alleyway. I expected a car to be waiting. I expected a man in a suit to step out of the darkness and usher me into a life I didn't want. But the alley was empty. The street was quiet. I let out a jagged breath, leaning against the cold brick wall. Maybe Marco was wrong. Maybe Caspian Vane had simply been moved by a moment of humanity and was expressing his gratitude the only way a monster knew how, through cold, hard cash and expensive gestures. I started the walk home, my footsteps echoing on the damp pavement. I took the long way, weaving through the well-lit avenues, trying to convince myself I was being dramatic. But as I turned onto my street, I saw a flickering light in my apartment window. I lived on the 3rd floor. I lived alone, and I had left the lights off. I froze at the base of the stairs, my hand hovering over the railing. My first instinct was to run, to find a payphone, to call the police, to find a hotel. But then I remembered the check. I remembered the car. The police wouldn't help me against Caspian Vane. They were likely the ones who had told them my address. I climbed the stairs, each step feeling like a mile. When I reached my door, I saw that the lock hadn't been picked. The door was slightly ajar, as if inviting me in. I pushed it open with the tip of my finger. The apartment was filled with the smell of home-cooked food. On my small, scratched wooden table sat 3 bags of high-end groceries and a steaming container of pasta from the city's best trattoria. But that wasn't what stopped my heart. Sitting on my bed, her legs swinging back and forth, was Lyra. She was wearing a simple cotton dress, her hair no longer in a tight braid, but falling in soft waves over her shoulders. She looked like a normal child, except for the way she sat in total, eerie silence. Standing by the window, silhouetted against the city lights, was Caspian. He didn't have his jacket on. His sleeves were rolled up, revealing forearms corded with muscle and a dark, intricate tattoo of a serpent winding around a crown. He looked less like a Mafia boss and more like a ghost that had finally decided to haunt its favorite house. "You're late, Sheila," he said, not turning around. "The pasta is getting cold." "What did you get in here?" I asked, my voice trembling with a mix of fury and terror. You can't be here." Caspian turned then. The moonlight caught the sharp edge of his cheekbone. "I can be anywhere I choose to be." But Lyra insisted. "She hasn't eaten all day." She told me, in her way, that she wouldn't touch a morsel unless you were the one to serve it. He stepped toward me, and I instinctively backed into the door. He stopped, a flicker of something, disappointment, amusement, crossing his features. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, silver key. He held it out to me. "The car is downstairs. The groceries are for your week. The money is for your peace of mind." "I don't want your money, Caspian," I snapped, the fear finally giving way to the exhaustion of the day. "I don't want your car. I just want to live my life." Caspian looked at Lyra, who was watching us with wide, knowing eyes. Then he looked back at me, his gaze dropping to my wrist, where Lyra had grabbed me the night before. "Your life was a slow death in a dark lounge, Sheila. You were hiding, but the girl saw you, and once she sees something, it belongs to her, which means it belongs to me." He stepped closer, his voice dropping to that terrifying, intimate register. "I'm not here to threaten you. I'm here to tell you that the world is coming for you. My enemies have already seen you at table 0. They know you're the only person who can make my daughter smile. That makes you the most valuable and the most vulnerable woman in this city." He took my hand, his skin searingly hot against my cold fingers. He pressed the silver key into my palm and forced my fingers to close over it. "I am not your obstacle, Sheila. I am your only shield. Tomorrow morning, a car will be waiting. You will come to the estate. You will spend the day with Lyra. And in return, I will make sure you live to see the next sunset." He didn't wait for an answer. He walked to the bed, picked up Lyra, and moved toward the door. As he passed me, Lyra reached out and touched my cheek. Her fingers were soft, and she signed a single word against my skin: "Please." The door clicked shut behind them, leaving me alone in the flickering light of my apartment. I looked at the groceries, the pasta, and the silver key in my hand. I looked at the lilies on my counter. I realized then that Caspian Vane hadn't just broken my silence. He had dismantled my cage, only to build a much larger, much more beautiful one around me. I sat down at the table and opened the pasta. It was delicious. It tasted like blood and gold. The silver key felt like a cold brand in my palm as the sun began to peek through the smog of the city. I didn't sleep. I spent the night watching the black SUV parked at the end of my block, its headlights dimmed, but its presence absolute. By 8 a.m., I was walking down the stairs, dressed in the most professional outfit I owned, a simple charcoal dress that felt like armor. The car door opened before I even reached the curb. A man with a jaw like granite and eyes that saw everything nodded to me. "Ms. Thorne, Mr. Vane is expecting you." The drive to the Vane estate was a journey into another world. We left the cracked pavement and neon signs of the city behind, winding up into the hills where the trees grew thick and the gates grew high. When the wrought iron gates of the estate finally swung open, I saw it, a sprawling fortress of glass and limestone that looked like it had been carved out of the mountain itself. Caspian was waiting on the terrace, a cup of black coffee in his hand. He looked different in the daylight, sharper, more permanent. Beside him stood Lyra, holding a weathered book. "You came," Caspian said, his voice cutting through the morning mist. "I didn't have much of a choice, did I?" I replied, stepping out of the car. He tilted his head, a small, dangerous smile playing on his lips. "Choice is a luxury for those who have nothing to lose. You, Sheila, have a gift. Today we see if that gift can be tempered into a tool." He led me inside, where the opulence was staggering. Marble floors, original Renaissance paintings, and a silence so deep it felt heavy. He brought me to a sun-drenched library and then did something I didn't expect. He left. "I have business to attend to," he said at the door. "Lyra has refused her lessons for 3 years. If you can get her to open that book, you'll have earned more than just your safety." The door clicked shut, and I was alone with the silent daughter of the city's most feared man. Lyra sat on a velvet ottoman, staring at me. She didn't use the tactile signing we had used in the dark of the restaurant. Here, in the light, she seemed to retreat. I sat on the floor, ignoring the expensive furniture, and waited. 10 minutes passed. 20. Finally, I began to sign into the air, not touching her, but letting her see the movements. "This room has too many books. Do they all stay quiet, or do they whisper at night?" Lyra's eyes tracked my hands. She hesitated, then reached out, grabbing my hand and pulling it to her palm. "They scream," she tapped out. "They scream about the things they've seen in this house." My blood ran cold. I realized then that while Caspian was her shield, he was also the source of the shadow she lived in. For the next 6 hours, we didn't study math or history. We spoke in the language of the skin. She told me about the men with no faces who visited her father, about the red water she had seen on the driveway once, and about her mother, who had been made of glass before she broke. By the time Caspian returned, Lyra was fast asleep with her head in my lap. The book finally opened to a page about the stars. He stood in the doorway, the setting sun casting a long, jagged shadow behind him. He looked at us, and for a fleeting second, the coldness in his eyes vanished, replaced by an expression so raw it was almost painful to look at. "She's quiet," he whispered, stepping into the room. "She's not quiet, Caspian," I said, my voice low so as not to wake her. "She's just waiting for someone to listen." He sat in the chair across from me, the weight of his world visible in the slump of his shoulders. "My enemies are moving, Sheila. The incident at the restaurant, it signaled a weakness. They think she's my Achilles heel. They don't realize that she's the only reason I haven't burned this city to the ground." He reached out, his hand hovering over Lyra's hair before he pulled it back, as if afraid his touch might corrupt her. "Stay the night. The guest house is prepared. It's not a request this time. Is it a kidnapping then? I asked. It's protection, he countered. In my world, there's no difference. As I was escorted to the guest house, a building larger than my entire apartment complex, I looked back at the main house. I saw Caspian standing on the balcony, a lone figure silhouetted against the rising moon. He was a man who had everything and nothing. And as I closed the door to my new cage, I realized the terrifying truth. I wasn't just afraid of him anymore. I was starting to feel sorry for him. The transition from a waitress's apron to a silk robe in a Manners guest house should have felt like a dream. But to me, it felt like being gift-wrapped for a predator. The invisible observer was no longer just a feeling. It was a reality. I quickly realized that every inch of the Vane estate was wired for sound and sight. When I woke up on my first official morning as Lyra's companion, a fresh wardrobe awaited me. Clothes in my exact size, in colors I had once mentioned to a coworker, were my favorites. Caspian wasn't just protecting me. He was studying me. By midday, the surreal luxury was interrupted by a jarring reminder of the world Caspian occupied. I was in the garden with Lyra, teaching her the signs for various flowers, when a black sedan screeched up the gravel path. Two men, bleeding and disheveled, were hauled out by Caspian's guards. Lyra didn't flinch. She didn't even look up. She simply continued to sign rose against my palm, her small face a mask of practiced indifference. It was then I realized that for Lyra, violence was as common as rain. Go inside, Sheila, a voice commanded from the terrace. Caspian stood there, his shirt unbuttoned at the collar, a heavy gold ring glinting on his finger. His face was set in a mask of cold fury that made the Vane shadow feel like a physical weight. She shouldn't have to see this, I said, my voice shaking as I stood my ground. She's a child, Caspian, not a soldier. Caspian descended the stairs, his eyes locking onto mine with an intensity that silenced the birds in the trees. In this city, there is no such thing as a child in the House of Vane. There are only targets and survivors. Which one do you want her to be? He leaned in close, the scent of expensive tobacco and ozone clinging to him. You think you're here to teach her history? You're here to give her a reason to want to survive. Now, take her inside. I obeyed, but as I led Lyra through the glass doors, I turned back. I saw Caspian gesture to his men, and the two intruders were dragged toward the basement. The contrast was sickening, the beauty of the blooming peonies against the brutality of the men in the dirt. That evening, the gifts continued. I found a package on my bed, a locket made of white gold. Inside was no photo, but a small, high-tech GPS chip. For your safety, the note read. It was a golden leash. Later, I sat in the kitchen, unable to eat the gourmet meal provided. The back door opened, and Caspian walked in, looking exhausted. He didn't say a word. He simply sat at the island and watched me. You're terrified of me tonight, he stated, his voice devoid of emotion. I saw the blood on the driveway, Caspian. I'm not a part of this world. You were the moment you touched her hand, he said, reaching out to pour a glass of amber liquid. My enemies don't care about your resume or your innocence. They see a woman who has found the only soft spot in Caspian Vane's heart. They see an opportunity. He slid the glass toward me. Drink. You'll need the courage. Tomorrow, we leave the estate. Lyra has a recital, and the whole city will be watching to see if the rumors about the waitress queen are true. I looked at the glass, then at him. The invisible observer had finally stepped into the light, and I realized that I wasn't just Lyra's teacher anymore. I was the bait. The transition from the fortified silence of the estate to the high-stakes public arena began at dawn. The golden cage was no longer a metaphor. It was a black, armored SUV with windows so dark they turned the morning sun into a bruised purple smudge. I sat in the plush leather interior, sandwiched between two of Caspian's silent shadows, while Lyra sat across from me, clutching a velvet case containing her violin. Remember, Caspian had whispered to me before we departed, his hand momentarily tightening on my shoulder. You are not there as a servant. You are there as a Vane. If anyone looks at you, you look through them. The Westridge Academy of Music was a bastion of old money and sharp tongues. As we stepped out of the car, the cameras didn't just flash. they felt like a barrage of gunfire. The vain shadow was now a spotlight. I felt the weight of 1,000 judgments as I walked beside Caspian, my hand resting protectively on Lyra's shoulder. The elite of the city, the women in silk and the men in power, parted like the Red Sea, their faces masks of polite terror and poisonous curiosity. "Is that the one?" I heard a woman hiss, her voice dripping with diamonds. "The girl from the pasta house? He's actually brought her here." I felt my face heat up, my old instinct to be invisible screaming at me to run. But then I felt Lyra's hand find mine. She didn't sign, but her grip was like iron. She was terrified, too. She was being paraded before a world that saw her as a broken doll, a pawn in her father's empire. In that moment, my fear vanished, replaced by a cold, protective rage. We were ushered into the front row, a space cleared by Caspian's men that felt like a DMZ. The air was thick with the scent of lilies and expensive perfume, but all I could smell was the ozone of impending trouble. As the lights dimmed, Caspian leaned toward me, his profile like a Roman coin in the dark. "Today, they see what I see," he murmured. "And tomorrow, they will fear what you can do." The performance began, a blur of talented children, but I couldn't focus. I was watching the exits, watching the way the security guards shifted their weight. I was waiting for the trap to spring. But the real trap was the music. When Lyra finally stood on that stage, a small, pale figure against the dark wood of the grand piano, the room fell into a silence deeper than the estate. She didn't look at the audience. She didn't look at her father. She looked at me. I raised my hand just high enough for her to see and tapped a slow, steady rhythm against my collarbone. 1-2, 1-2, a heartbeat in the dark. The first note she struck wasn't a sound. It was a breakthrough. The entire academy, the restaurant, the city, the cage seemed to dissolve. But as the music reached its peak, I saw a movement in the balcony that didn't belong to a music lover. A red dot flickered for a fraction of a second against the velvet curtain behind Lyra's head. My heart stopped. The golden cage was about to be shattered by a lead. The music was a masterpiece, but the world was a nightmare. I saw the red laser dance across the ivory keys of the piano, inching toward Lyra's small, focused chest. Time didn't just slow down, it fractured. I didn't look at Caspian. I didn't have to. I felt the sudden, violent tension in his body as his hand moved toward the inside of his jacket. "Get down!" I didn't care about the elite audience or the vain shadow. I lunged from my seat, my body a blur of charcoal fabric, as I threw myself onto the stage. The crack of the gunshot was suppressed, a sickening thwip that shattered the lid of the grand piano just inches from Lyra's head. Screams erupted as the audience scrambled, but I was already on top of her, shielding her small body with mine. The scent of splintered wood and cordite filled my nose. "Stay low, Lyra. Don't move." I signed frantically against her shoulder, my heart hammering like a war drum. Caspian was a storm unleashed. He didn't run for cover. He moved toward the balcony where the shooter was perched, his own weapon drawn with a lethal, practiced speed. His security detail surged forward, forming a human wall around the stage. The vain shadow was no longer a metaphor. It was a literal shield of men and steel. The firefight was brief and brutal. From my position on the floor, I saw Caspian look back at us, his eyes burning with a cold, terrifying fire I had never seen before. It wasn't the look of a businessman. It was the look of a man whose heart had been threatened and who was about to erase the threat from existence. When the silence returned, it was heavier than before. The shooter had been neutralized, dragged away into the shadows of the theater. Caspian stepped onto the stage, his breathing steady, his suit barely wrinkled. He reached down and pulled me and Lyra to our feet. For the first time in front of the world, he didn't maintain his distance. He pulled both of us into a single, crushing embrace. I felt the heat of his body and the vibration of his voice as he spoke into the silence of the hall. "Anyone who thought she was a weakness," he announced, his voice carrying to every corner of the room, "has just made their final mistake. Sheila Thorne is not a guest. She is family. And the Vane family does not forget. In the aftermath, as we were ushered back to the armored SUV, I saw the crack in the armor. In the privacy of the darkened car, Caspian took my hand. His fingers were trembling, not with fear, but with a raw, unbridled emotion. He looked at me, then at Lyra, who was staring at him with wide, silent eyes. "You saved her," he whispered, his voice thick. "You didn't run. You stayed. I told you," I said, my voice finally breaking. "I'm her light." He didn't respond with words. He leaned in and pressed his forehead against mine, a gesture of intimacy so profound it felt more significant than any kiss. The waitress from the Onyx Lounge was gone. The woman standing in the center of the Vane Empire was finally beginning to understand that the terrible thing that happened to the restaurant wasn't the meeting. It was the moment she realized she never wanted to leave. The fallout from the recital was a seismic shift that leveled the social hierarchy of the city. We didn't return to the guest house. Caspian's men moved my meager belongings into the main estate before the sun had even set. I was no longer a guest or a tutor. I had become a focal point of the Vane power structure. But the transition wasn't marked by peace. It was marked by a cold, sharp intention. The following evening, Caspian hosted a reconciliation gala. It was a strategic move, a way to show the world that the assassination attempt had failed and that he was stronger than ever. The grand ballroom was a sea of silk, gold, and forced smiles. I stood at Caspian's side, dressed in a gown of midnight blue that felt like a second skin. Beside me, Lyra sat in a chair of carved obsidian, her violin resting on her lap like a weapon. The air was thick with the scent of expensive gin and unspoken threats. That was when Mrs. Blackwell, the undisputed matriarch of the city's old money, approached us. She looked at me with a disdain so sharp it could have drawn blood. "A waitress, Caspian," she sneered, her voice carrying just enough to ensure the surrounding circle heard. "You've invited a girl who spent her last week clearing breadcrumbs to stand among the foundation of this city? It's a charming charity project, but let's not pretend she belongs behind these gates." The circle of socialites leaned in, waiting for the humiliation. My old life, the tired feet, the starch-collared uniforms, the invisibility felt like a weight around my neck. But before I could speak, I felt a small, warm hand slip into mine. Lyra stood up. She didn't sign. She didn't look at her father. She looked directly at Mrs. Blackwell and did something that made the music in the room stop for the second time in 2 days. She opened her mouth. Lyra said, her voice raspy from years of disuse, but incredibly clear, "Is my heart." The silence that followed was deafening. It was a physical blow that sent Mrs. Blackwell reeling back. Caspian stepped forward, his eyes shimmering with a terrifying pride. He didn't reach for a weapon. He didn't have to. He reached for my hand, interlacing his fingers with mine in front of everyone. "Mrs. Blackwell," Caspian said, his voice a low, lethal purr. "You are mistaken. Sheila didn't come here to belong to your world. She came here to change mine. And in this house, her word is law. If you find that distasteful, the exits are exactly where you left them. But remember, once you walk out, you stay out." As the elite scrambled to offer their hollow apologies, Caspian led me away from the crowd toward the moonlit terrace. The waitress queen was no longer a mockery. It was a title forged in the fire of the previous night. "You heard her," Caspian whispered, leaning down so his breath brushed my ear. "She spoke. For you. She spoke for us, Caspian," I replied, looking out over the city that now felt like it lay at our feet. The line had been crossed. The entire restaurant, the entire academy, and now the entire city knew. I wasn't just a witness to the Vane Empire anymore. I was the heartbeat of it. But as I looked at the dark horizon, I knew that being the heart meant I would be the first thing the enemies of the shadow would try to stop. The dawn that broke over the Vane estate was different from any I had ever known. The air felt thinner, charged with the electric realization that my life as a ghost in the machine was over. I stood on the balcony of the master suite, wrapped in a silk robe that felt like a coronation gown, watching the sun burn through the mountain mist. Behind me, the room was silent, but it was no longer the heavy, oppressive silence of a tomb. It was the quiet of a house that had finally learned how to breathe. Caspian joined me, his presence a steady heat at my back. He didn't speak. He didn't have to. He simply placed his hands on the marble railing on either side of me, effectively boxing me into his world. For the first time, I didn't feel trapped. I felt anchored. The city is waking up to a new reality, Sheila, he said, his voice a low vibration against my spine. The papers are calling you the Oracle of the Lounge. They think you're a mystic who broke a curse. They don't understand that you didn't use magic. You just used a heart. I turned in the circle of his arms, looking up into those stormy gray eyes. Is that what this is, Caspian? A new reality? Or is it just a bigger cage with more expensive locks? He reached out, his thumb tracing the line of my jaw with a tenderness that still felt alien coming from a man who could command an army of shadows. A cage implies you're being held against your will. The gates are open, Sheila. The car is waiting if you want it. You could take the money, change your name, and disappear into the ordinary life you used to crave. I thought about the Onyx Lounge, the smell of stale wine, the scratched collars, the invisibility. I thought about the girl I was, the one who was so afraid of being hurt that she stopped living. Then I thought about Lyra's voice, the raspy, beautiful sound of her calling me her heart. I can't go back, I whispered. Not because of the danger, but because the woman who lived that life doesn't exist anymore. The resolution didn't come with a grand ceremony. It came with a choice. I spent the afternoon in the garden, not as a tutor, but as a mother in every way that mattered. Lyra and I sat among the peonies, our hands moving in a synchronized dance of signs and spoken words. She was laughing, a sound so rare and precious it felt like catching lightning in a jar. That evening, Caspian called me into his study. The room was usually off-limits, a sanctuary of leather-bound secrets and cold business. But today the doors were wide open. He was sitting at his desk, but he wasn't looking at ledgers. He was looking at a small, silver-framed photograph of me and Lyra from the recital. I have spent my life building walls, Sheila, he said, not looking up. I thought if I made the walls high enough, the world couldn't reach her. I didn't realize I was just making sure she was alone when the world eventually broke in. You tore those walls down in a single night at a dinner table. He stood up and walked toward me, pulling a small, velvet box from his pocket. He didn't go to one knee. That wasn't his way. He held it out, his gaze unwavering. I'm a man with many enemies and a past that is written in ink I can't erase. I can't promise you peace, but I can promise you that as long as I draw breath, you and Lyra will never be alone in the dark again. I opened the box. It wasn't a diamond. It was a signet ring, the veined serpent winding around a crown, but with a small, brilliant emerald set into the serpent's eye, the color of my own eyes. It was a seal of belonging. Yes, I said, the word a soft echo of the one I had whispered to myself 1,000 times since table 0. The waitress queen had found her throne, not in a palace of gold, but in the heart of a man who had forgotten how to feel. As the sun set over the city, I looked at the wrought iron gates in the distance. They were still there, and the world outside was still dangerous. But for the first time in my life, I wasn't hiding from the storm. I was the one who commanded it. We had forged a family from the broken pieces of our pasts, a family built not on blood, but on the silent promise that we would never let go. The silence was finally over, and the story was just beginning. Would you risk your life to speak for a child who has no voice? Or would you stay silent to save yourself? Sheila chose to speak, and it changed her world forever. If you believe that one person's courage can break a curse, hit the like button and subscribe for more thrilling stories from the shadows. Comment, silence is over. If you would have stood your ground like Sheila,